Without further ado, I want to welcome the DataKind CEO, Giselle Corey, who will be chairing today's event.
Yeah, DataKind. So DataKind incubates the Data Collective. That's the connection. We are first hearing from Peter and then hearing from Stephen, two absolutely brilliant speakers. I'm going to do a quick intro to Pete and we'll hear from him for about 15 minutes, and then a quick intro to Stephen and we'll hear from him for 15 minutes again, and then our Q&A. So to intro Pete, after undertaking apparently a disastrous degree subject at university, but we've been told not to ask, Pete found his niche with a master's in social research methods whilst working as a research assistant in the planning section of what was formerly Dorset County Council. He moved into the corporate centre of the organisation as a senior research officer and then became a principal research analyst at Dorset Council. So his work covers a breadth of service areas, including children's and adult services, as well as place and emerging national policy issues like, of course, COVID, the Ukrainian crisis, and the cost of living challenge, which brings us to this work. So today, Pete's going to talk about what the council are doing on the latter, on the cost of living challenge. One last thing I've forgotten. So Pete, his work does include spatial analysis, so using GIS, which some of you might know, which is a kind of common mapping spatial analysis tool, predictive analysis, which we'll be hearing a bit about today, and also social and demographic insight. Understanding more about people and areas and how that interacts with his work. So without any further introduction, I'm going to hand over to Pete, who I think will also be sharing slides.
Yeah, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, so my name is Pete Jackson. I'm the principal research analyst working in the business intelligence team at Dorset Council, and I'm going to run through what we've been doing here at Dorset Council in relation to the cost of living crisis or challenge, however you want to put it. To give you a bit of background, I'm sure you all know this, but emerging from the pandemic, we had increased energy demand from the economies that were booting back up in the Southeast Asian market. And of course, then we had the conflict in Ukraine, which reduced the supply of energy and led to a dramatic increase in energy prices. So our senior leadership team at Dorset Council, they wanted to know what it meant for us. So they asked business intelligence to model what this could mean for Dorset going forward. As many of you probably know, getting hold of decent income data at a small geography is really difficult. So we managed to get hold of model data from Experian that looks at household discretionary income by different household groups across Dorset. And discretionary income is defined as what a household or an individual has to invest, save or spend after they spend everything on necessities. So we've looked at this data in detail and we've considered what this means for the residents of Dorset. And then we've produced, using Power BI, a predictive model for the Dorset Council area. So the model has a range of data integrated into it up until April 2023. And very recently, we managed to plug in the new data into it as well. So for the information that came out of the autumn statement. So we've got the energy price guarantee. We've got inflation figures from the OBR. We've got wage inflation from the OBR. We've got the current cost of living universal mitigation for £400 for every household. We then got the additional payments for those on universal credit and older residents. We weren't able to put in the disability, the £150 disability payment, because it was very hard to define which groups would get that using the household data on Mosaic. But everything else we managed to get in there. And this data has been looked at over time to consider the potential impacts by household group and by area. It's very important that I stress, and I always do this when I have to do a presentation on this, this is just model data. It can only ever provide us with a guide. It might not be exact. It will just give us a good idea of which areas of our council area are likely to be more impacted than others. So earlier this summer, and this was prior to the government's interventions, the model was adjusted to reflect the impact of anticipated energy price cap. You might remember Cornwall Insights, and they're still doing this, were able to give us the likely energy price cap for January 2023 and April 2023. And at that time, they were talking about £4,200 in January and £6,000 in April without any of the mitigation. So the following slides will illustrate the potential impact this was going to have on Dorset's residents, projected through to January and April 23. And then followed by that is the impact we're now predicting, given the government's intervention, and also what's going to follow in 2024. So we're working closely with our community and engagement team, as well as the voluntary sector in Dorset, to help target our resources more effectively. And here's one of the slides from our model. And this was a slide that was illustrating what would happen if we had a fuel cap of 4,200 in January of 2023. And we put all the data in, and it was showing that we were looking at 42%, 43% of our households in Dorset would be in the red. And the same number of households would have less than £50 discretionary income left. And, you know, really quite scary. And if we moved on and looked at the second quarter of 2023 with the fuel cap of £6,000, we were looking at the same number of households in the red, but even more households that were going to be significantly impacted. So basically, we were looking at half the households in Dorset would have less than £50 discretionary income at the end of each month. So this was, you know, this was quite concerning. This is as is. So this is what the situation with the mitigation, and now with the energy price guarantee that the government have introduced. And we're looking at, according to the model, none of our households hopefully will be in the red, but we've got about 10,000 who are going to be significantly impacted. That's 5% of our households across Dorset. And if you think about that in relation to the number of people, if those sort of households are family basic households, which is one of the groups in Mosaic, which is basically about 4 people within that household, then we're talking about 30,000, 40,000 people potentially impacted. So it's still a significant impact. Moving on, we're now being able to model the data with the new information given by the Chancellor a couple of weeks ago, with the new energy price guarantee and the mitigation for older people and those on universal credit. And with that information, we're able to sort of project forward what is likely to occur in the first quarter of 2024. And as you can see, the situation is going to be worse for Dorset based on that. And that's probably because we're going to be looking at a number of different families and households that will not be getting any of the mitigation, because they probably are just, their income levels will be too high to receive universal credit, and they will not be older people or people with disabilities, so they're going to be impacted. And then moving on to the second quarter, when we don't know what's going to happen with regard to the energy price guarantee at this stage, so we're going to have an increase in our number of households in the red. So again, a significant impact. The model also enables us to map that data. So this is the map for the first quarter of 2023. And we can see which areas, and we can drill down, so we can work with our colleagues in public health and in the voluntary sector and drill down into areas such as Dorchester or Swanage to see which areas we think are likely to see the greatest impact from the cost of living crisis. And that's been proven very useful for when we've been doing presentations and working with our colleagues in the voluntary sector. And then we can move it forward as well. We can run the model forward to see how it changes over time. So that, of course, is really useful for our colleagues and for us as well. What we were also able to do is we were able to build in sentiment analysis into the tool. And this has proven really interesting because we can focus on particular topics on Twitter, such as the economy or the energy, which is what we've got up here, energy bills, food, fuel, general costs and support. And we can see whether the sentiment is negative, neutral or positive. And we've got like a little word cloud there with some of the words that were being mentioned on Twitter. What I've done here is I've zoomed into the time during the leadership contest, and just afterwards, when the previous Prime Minister announced her energy price guarantee. And you can see from this side of things that there was lots of negativity with regards to energy and bills and how they dropped away when the energy price guarantee was announced. Afterwards, now, if I was to flick onto one of the others, I imagine the concern probably would have risen after the announcement of the previous Chancellor's mini budget, when everything went a bit haywire. But that's proven to be really interesting, and it helps with our senior officers and our members to just to let them know that what the concerns are like out there. So what's the impact of the model been? Well, as I said, we presented it to our senior leaders because they asked for it. And their immediate reaction was to release resources and capacity to help our community engagement team. And they're working with the voluntary sector, and they're working with them to target additional resources effectively. We also highlighted those 40s and 50%. We highlighted what the potential impact would be to our MPs during the summer if nothing was done. And this was during the period of the leadership contest. So we like to think that they rushed off to Westminster and told the contenders what the impact would be, but I doubt that was the case. But it certainly had an impact on them. And then we continue to plug new data into the model as it becomes available, which is really useful aspect to the model. And as I said, we're now incorporating the current mitigation for 2023-24, as well as the inflation figures and other data such as the triple lock and the wage inflation. So all in all, we're proud of the work that we've done, and we think that it's been quite impactful, or very impactful. And we're working with our colleagues in the voluntary sector to try and make sure that we do target our resources, our limited resources, as effectively as possible. So thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Got loads of yeah, there we go. Got loads of questions bubbling in my mind, and I hope in everyone's too. If you do have questions, feel free to either save them up for the Q&A or pop them in the chat now, and we can start kind of grouping them together. So without too much of a pause, I'm going to take us straight on to our next speaker, Stephen. So we have Stephen here. You'll see cameras on. Stephen is the Director of Delivery and Impact at Power to Change. So for those who don't know, Power to Change is an organisation that focuses on community businesses and their impact in strengthening local communities. So they bring partners together to fund, grow and back community businesses to make places thrive. Stephen today will be talking about their work on putting insight into action, working with others to design new programs and services and elevate their data and tell stories through it. So we'll be talking about the facet that relates to our current cost of living crisis today. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chazelle. Hoping that the screen share's worked okay, but do shout if it's not working. So as Chazelle said, I'm going to talk about how at Power to Change we've used data in different ways to try and respond to the sort of cost of living and energy crises. And so I'll start off just talking a very little bit about Power to Change and what community business is, before talking more about how we then have tried to respond to the crisis as it's developed using a data-led approach and what that responses look like. So very quickly on Power to Change, as Chazelle mentioned, we're a independent trust. We were established in 2015 with £150 million spend down endowment to support community businesses in England. And we do this in a range of different ways, but primarily through funding and support. And we're sort of really keen to support communities to tackle, challenges that they face, but also some of the biggest challenges that we're facing at the moment as a society. So namely the opportunities presented by digital transformation, as well as the challenges, but also obviously ongoing social inequities, as well as climate change. And we have quite a good track record of already investing in things like community-owned renewable energy, but we have a sort of long-standing interest in how we respond to the climate and nature crises at a local level. And that's, I think, important context for how we've then responded to the cost of living crisis. So community businesses are essentially any type of business but run by communities themselves. So they can be shops, pubs, leisure centres, solar energy farms, as I've mentioned, local libraries, you name it, it can be run by the community. But what distinguishes them is that they are run for the benefit of that community. So they tend to be of and in a particular place. So in this photo here, you can see Moseley Road Baths in Birmingham, so very specific to that part of Birmingham. But they're led by the community, so there's broad involvement and engagement in how they run, the trading for benefit, and the repurposing the profits for social impact to improve the lives of local people. And one of the, well, several of the things that sort of distinguish them are they're often formed when communities come together to save a particular building, such as the sort of beautiful building you see in the screen. But also they take a range of different forms. So they're very sort of diverse and heterogeneous sort of subset of the wider SME sector. And that's really important, I think, for understanding how then we've had to think about supporting them longer term. It's also, I think, sort of really important to understand them in the sort of the broader context of SMEs and the third sector as well. So, you know, it's still a relatively small sector, although it has doubled in the last 7 years. But there's about 11,000 community businesses now, and they tend to operate in the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country. And you know, over the last few years, we've invested over 100 million into the sector, and about 2/3 of that money has gone into the most deprived 30% of neighborhoods. And we've had this real focus about supporting communities to sort of have spaces where they can get together and connect with each other. And we've seen the sort of the impact of that in terms of improved community cohesion, reducing social isolation, you know, providing a range of services that aren't necessarily being provided by others. But we've also seen the economic impact of that as well. And the community business is very good at recycling money and retaining wealth in their local area. But one of the sort of challenges we faced as an organisation was that because this is a sort of relatively small and diverse subset of the wider business population, there was sort of gap in our knowledge base and a gap in the evidence base about them. So we've invested very heavily in building up the sort of evidence and data related to community businesses in a range of different ways, because what we wanted to do is understand how we could best support them, but also demonstrate to others how they could also support them and how they could grow this sector. Because Power to Change was set up as a time-limited foundation. So once the endowment is spent down, then that's you know, theoretically the end of our existence. So we need others to sort of step in and continue to support this movement. So we've had a really strong emphasis on, you know, good quality, robust evidence. We've also been trying to plug gaps in information. So on the screen here, you can see a resource called Keep It in the Community, which lists publicly lists assets of community value. And that is data that is collected by local authorities all around the country but isn't routinely or systematically published. And we sort of created the space for that to be made more visible. And also that communities can upload data themselves where perhaps local authorities don't have the sort of the oversight. We've also been looking at how we use existing data to relieve pressure on communities as well. And all of this, again, is really important context to how we've then responded to the cost of living crisis. So We were getting sort of anecdotal messages coming through in the spring this year that some organizations were already worried about the impact of energy price increases that were happening back in April, but also that they were sort of witnessing increased demand for their services, as well as inflation rose and food prices went up, etc. But what we had was a gap in our sort of understanding, I think. So firstly, like everyone else, what was the government going to do about it? Because we didn't want to duplicate effort, and actually we knew that it was quite a significant scale of challenge to address. But also we didn't know what the specific impact on the community business sector was likely to be either, because the sort of data wasn't necessarily there in the format that was easily accessible. And so those 2 points then sort of inhibited our ability to formulate what the scale of our response should be and the form of our response. And so that's what we thought about addressing. So we already knew that that community businesses operate in very often very large and old buildings, and that makes them potentially energy inefficient buildings, but also that they're operating in areas of deprivation and low levels of discretionary income, which made passing on the costs of the increased energy bills, etc., not very viable or possible. And then what makes these organizations unique is that, at the same time they're facing all these challenges, they're also experiencing increased demand for their services, because often they may be running a food bank out of their space. We were hearing lots of organizations, in the heat of summer when it was 40 degrees or what have you, thinking ahead to the winter about how to potentially provide warm bank services where people could huddle together in a shared space and keep warm. All that at the same time thinking about how they were going to afford this themselves, because they were all on commercial energy meters, which weren't included in the price cap that we all know as sort of resident retail energy users. So we thankfully over several years have been working with an organization called MyCake to build up a database of financial accounts information for a large number of community businesses, because we were interested in it from a research perspective about understanding financial performance amongst community businesses. But what that previous investment enabled us to do is then to start building some statistical modeling on top of that to understand what the potential impact of increased costs might be. So we were particularly interested in increases in obviously energy costs, as signified by the utility costs on the screen here, but also the potential impact of other inflationary pressures. Particularly, one of the things that we were getting back from our network or through our networks was that organizations were worried about their ability to retain staff if they couldn't pay them a cost of living increase. So these were all things that we were really keen to model and understand better. And what that modeling enabled us to do is to start looking at potentially a range of different scenarios, and I'll come on to that in a second, but also potentially the sort of the sector-wide impact. So although this is only a sort of subset of community businesses, it's probably the best modeling we could produce at the time. And I think, as Pete said, this modeled data, so it just provided us with a guide, but we could see that what we were looking at as a sector was very significant increases in energy bills, and potentially a large number of organizations having energy cost increases that may have well been unsustainable for them, because we know that they're often operating on thin margins, and obviously these are providing quite important services within their community. So the risk of them going under is very significant in a time of crisis. So we were also able to use this model to start modeling different scenarios, because back in the summer, it was still really unclear what the government were going to do, and also what the potential energy price increases were going to be, what the potential rate of inflation was going to be. So we had to model multiple scenarios to understand both what was going to happen to the sector, but also potentially what our contribution could be. So on the screen here, you can see that in the worst case scenario, we were looking at prices increasing up to potentially energy prices increasing up to 5 times the current rate, but also inflation potentially being around 13%. And what we saw was that was tipping the majority of the sector into making a loss. So from 35% of the sector being in deficit at any one time to the majority of the sector at 67%. So we were also able to use the model to start looking at, well, if we were to make some grants to these community buildings, what would be the potential dampening effect of that, and what size grant would we need? And the sort of the heuristic we were using, the basic rule of thumb, because we were moving at pace as well, was to try and get the percentage of the sector making a loss under 50%, because we knew that actually we do not have the resources to support the whole sector with a sort of challenge of this scale, but we wanted to be able to at least try and protect half of the sector, and that was the state of things back in the summer. So the third and final aspect of our modelling was that we were also able to start sort of ranking organisations within the data set into essentially risk categories, using a range of variables around, the working capital they had available to them, and then also the increased costs they were potentially likely to face and the impact of that on their finances. And then we applied some additional weighting to that, to those elements, to enable us to then identify which organisations were most likely to be worst affected by some of these potential changes. And what we could see was that there were particular types of organisations that were worst affected, and they were in certain subsectors. So we had community hubs and village halls, food and farming businesses, sports and leisure, and also health and social care organisations, particularly residential care homes, all of which are tend to have large spaces, and also tend to be intensive energy users for various reasons. So we knew that was going to be a challenge, and also we were able to then sort of project what the potential knock-on effects on the wider sector might be. So those sectors that I just listed make up about a third of the total sector as we have previously modelled it. So we knew actually it was quite a significant risk element to the sector more broadly, and this movement has been developing over the last few years. So our response has been informed by the changing external context, and thankfully the government stepped in September to try and reduce wholesale energy prices, and so that has had has had a very positive effect on lots of those community-owned buildings. The challenge, of course, is that it's only temporary at the moment, and so it's being reviewed, and at the moment it's only guaranteed until the spring. So we knew there was a need to both support these organisations through the winter, but also to think about how they get ahead of the curve in the future and actually become energy resilient longer term. So we developed a sort of emergency fund where we provided sort of modest sized grants, about £10,000, alongside specialist energy advice and support to a range of community-owned buildings to help them both navigate the immediate pressures, but also start thinking longer term. And this was new approach for us, because we recognised there was a need to move very quickly before the winter came, effectively, and so we went out only to our existing portfolio of grantees, which is very unusual for us, and was a sort of presented a range of different challenges, but we were able to start bringing in lots of other different data sets and data points that we had access to really identify who potentially were the sort of the highest priority community buildings to approach in the first instance. So they had to be within the key sectors. So there was about 1,000 in our database that were in those sectors. They had to own or manage an asset. They had to, we pulled in some of the additional modelling around financial risk. So they had to be, I suppose, high energy users or have potentially high exposure to energy price increases. And then we also brought in additional data points to make sure that we were targeting our resources in areas where there's particularly high need. So we've brought in data from the indices of multiple deprivation, although we don't exclusively use that because we recognise that it's potentially a slightly flawed measure for rural areas in particular. But we also then brought in additional data from the fuel poverty index as well to understand what the need was in the wider area. So I'm probably reaching my time now, so I'm just going to sort of pause and reflect on like where we've got to. So we're just in the process of awarding those grants now, so it's not complete. It's not a completed project, but what we've seen from the applications we've received about how those organizations want to use the money has been a real vindication of the data analysis and the modeling that we were doing back in the summer, because we can see that actually there is still a need to cover excess energy bills, and these organizations also want to pay their staff better. But lots of these organizations, and this is also part of what we are advocating and steering organizations towards, are looking at how they can introduce low-cost energy saving measures now. So things like LED light bulbs or insulation on pipes or what have you, as well as also do building audits to think about what sort of longer-term solutions they may implement. And that will be the next round of funding that we're launching next year, which will be a much bigger round to support and fund those more capital intensive measures. So thinking about installing solar panels on your roofs and loft insulation, for example, or heat pumps to bring down those costs longer term, so that if energy costs keep going up, these organizations are either taken out of that equation, or at least their exposure to it is significantly reduced. So I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of time, but I look forward to sort of talking a bit more about this, and also hearing from others about anything similar that they're doing.
Thank you.